Get out. Take care of yourself. That was the last thing my father said to me on my 18th birthday. That day, I stood up and called out the favoritism he had always shown toward my older brother. And the result? I was kicked out of the house. But that wasn't the end of the story. 11 years later, my grandfather passed away. In his will, he left my father a single gift, a family photo album. My parents and brother ripped it to shreds. What they didn't realize was that one act cost them a fortune. So, what exactly did my grandfather leave behind in his will? Stay with me. I'm going to tell you everything that happened. Hello, everyone. My name is Hazel, and I'm 30 years old. I am the Chief Financial Officer for a logistics company in Denver, Colorado. Each day of my life passes by quietly. I wake up early, make coffee, and head to the office. Being a CFO means I constantly handle reports, analyze data, and sit in meetings with the leadership team. There's some pressure, but I appreciate the stability the job brings. After my shift ends in the afternoon, I head back to my 3-bedroom home in a peaceful neighborhood. Once I'm home, I usually cook for myself. The dishes I make are simple meals I've learned through YouTube videos. I like to watch Netflix or occasionally grab coffee at my regular spot in the evenings. Back in the day, on weekends, I used to drive about 2 hours to visit my grandfather. He was the only family member I still kept in touch with. Those quiet afternoons with him were always the most precious moments of my week. But then, age finally caught up with him a year ago, and he couldn't escape the inevitable. The day of his funeral was the loneliest day of my life. Since that day, it's just been me and my memories of him. If it weren't for my grandfather, my life probably would have gone in a completely different direction. And the memory that makes me miss him the most is the time he stood up for me against the people who brought me into this world 12 years ago. My family drama started 12 years ago on a weekend in June 2013. That day was my birthday, meant to celebrate both that and my high school graduation. My parents threw a small party at home. My mom cooked a few simple dishes and quickly picked up a store-bought cake. Looking at the simple party, I couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. I remembered 2 years earlier when my older brother Dylan graduated from high school with decent grades. My parents splurged and took the whole family out to a fancy restaurant. They reserved a big table and invited some of Dylan's friends to join. I clearly remember my parents' excitement, snapping photos nonstop and posting all over Facebook showing Dylan's achievement. But when I graduated with honors, a higher achievement than Dylan's, they only gave me a small party at home. No restaurant, no guests, and not even a hint of the same excitement. That stirred up a sense of jealousy in me. Still, the disappointment and jealousy didn't last long once I saw my grandfather show up at my little party. He walked into the house with a bright smile, holding a neatly wrapped gift box. To me, he was the priceless gift life had given me. As long as he was there, nothing else really mattered. The first 30 minutes of the party went by as expected. When we sat down for dinner, my dad, David, started talking about things happening at his job. He went on about a new project at the bank where he worked, some demanding clients, and how he'd just gotten a raise. His voice was full of excitement as he shared his accomplishments. Then my mom, Madison, jumped into the conversation. She talked about a new female coworker who had just joined her office, how classy she dressed, and how she had experience working in several companies. My mom seemed genuinely impressed by her. Dylan, meanwhile, eagerly talked about his college friends and a new girlfriend he had just started seeing. He gave a complete play-by-play of how they met at the library, their first date, and how beautiful and intelligent she was. Even though it was my birthday, nobody paid attention to me. They just kept talking among themselves like I wasn't even there. I just sat there poking at my cake with a fork, feeling like a guest in my own family. Only my grandfather genuinely cared. His warm voice made me feel seen. He asked about my college plans, hobbies, and things I looked forward to. Every question he asked came from a place of sincere interest. Amid that distant, disconnected atmosphere, I thought about the drawer in my room where I had hidden my college scholarship letter. I was torn about whether or not I should share the good news with them. Part of me wanted to tell them. I imagined them standing up, hugging me tight. I pictured my parents looking at me with pride, like they always looked at Dylan. But another part of me was scared. I was afraid that if I said it out loud, their reaction would be the same as always, cold and indifferent. Because in my family, Dylan was the only one who mattered. And me, no matter how well I did, I was just his shadow. After thinking it through, I decided I would share the good news. They were my family, and I felt they deserved to know about this achievement. While everyone had finally stopped talking and was focused on their food, I glanced around the dinner table. Trying to keep my voice steady, I said, I have some good news to share. Right after I spoke, everyone turned their eyes toward me and waited. My dad paused mid-chew, my mom put down her fork, and Dylan looked up from his phone. They all stared at me, curiosity in their eyes, unsure what I was about to say. Without saying another word, I stood up and quickly walked to my room to get the letter. I returned to the dining room about a minute later, gripping the letter tightly with a mix of pride and nervous excitement. I said, I got a full-ride scholarship to study finance at the University of Denver. And just like I had feared, everything played out exactly as I had predicted. After I shared my news, my parents and brother didn't show a hint of genuine happiness. No applause, no beaming smiles, not even a handshake or hug. My dad looked at me for a few seconds, his face still expressionless, then said, A full scholarship, huh? That's good. It'll save quite a bit on college expenses. The dryness in his voice hit me like a weight in my chest. As soon as he finished, my mom cut in. With a flat, emotionless tone, she said, A full scholarship is expected with your abilities. Nothing to brag about. Her words left me stunned. There was no hug, no congratulations, nothing. At that moment, I wished I could turn back time and keep the news to myself. As for Dylan, he looked at me for a few seconds, then said, Congrats. It sounded forced, like he was saying it out of obligation. He went right back to his plate, eyes glued to his phone screen. Watching their reactions, I felt like I had just shared good news with a group of strangers. While I was still reeling from the disappointment caused by the people I once called family, my grandfather stood up. The sound of his chair sliding across the floor broke the silence in the room. He walked over to me with slow but purposeful steps. When he reached me, he pulled me into a tight hug. It was warm and full of love, a complete contrast to the cold indifference I had just received from my parents and Dylan. His hand patted my back firmly, each pat feeling like it carried all the love and pride he had for me. With a voice filled with pride and sincerity, my grandfather said, Well done, Hazel. Getting a full-ride scholarship is no small thing. Hearing those genuine words of praise, my eyes suddenly started to sting. His actions and kind words gave me a sense of comfort. A warmth spread through me, softening the sting of the pain my parents and Dylan had just caused. At least in that room of 5 people, one person was genuinely proud of what I had accomplished. One person who understood how much this achievement meant to me. After my grandfather's hug, I sat back down at the table and continued with what was supposed to be my birthday dinner. But the atmosphere had shifted completely. Everyone just focused on eating, occasionally glancing at each other. My dad stared down at his plate. My mom kept sipping her water, and Dylan was still glued to his phone. The joy from earlier had vanished, replaced by tension and discomfort. I didn't know then that this would be my last birthday party, my last dinner with my parents and brother, because what happened next would change everything. After everyone moved on to dessert during a casual conversation, my grandfather suddenly turned to my dad with a voice full of care. He said, David, you should give her $1,500 monthly. After Hazel starts college, with that support, she could focus entirely on her studies without getting a job. The moment my grandfather finished speaking, my dad looked at him with surprise and calculation in his eyes. I watched his face tense up, like he was weighing something serious. The mood in the room instantly shifted, thick with tension. A few seconds later, my dad responded in a cold voice. Hazel will have to handle everything on her own. I can't help her. Hearing his words, my grandfather looked utterly stunned. And me, I was hit like I had just been slapped in the face. In my head, I had always assumed my parents would help me with living expenses, at least in the same way they had helped Dylan. For the past 2 years, they had covered Dylan's expenses: tuition, rent, food, even money for entertainment. Every year, they spent no less than $30,000 on him. They paid for everything. But me, I had already covered my tuition with a scholarship. That meant all they had to do was help with around $1,000 a month, just enough to live on. And now they were telling me I was on my own. I couldn't accept that kind of favoritism. I looked my dad straight in the face and asked, You're not serious, right? The moment I asked that, my mom must have realized things were about to escalate. She quickly cut in, trying to smooth things over. Softly, she said, It's not that we don't want to help, honey. It's just that things are a bit tight financially right now. As soon as she said that, I turned to look at her. I felt my blood boil at how ridiculous that excuse sounded. I asked her, Financially tight? Dad was bragging about getting a raise. Or is it just that everything always goes to Dylan, not me? The moment I brought up Dylan, my dad exploded. His face turned red and his eyes burned with hostility. He slammed the table, making the dishes shake, then shouted in my face, "That's enough. You're competing with your own family. Dylan is your brother." His voice echoed through the room. My heart was pounding, but I had held it in for too long. With the last bit of courage I had, I said to him, "And you've always favored him. Everyone sees it." What I said was like striking a match to a fuse. My dad completely lost it. He shot up from his seat, pointed his finger straight at me, and screamed with pure hatred in his voice, "Get out of here. Take care of yourself from now on." The room froze in a heavy, terrifying silence. After those words, Dylan had finally set his phone down. His face had gone pale, and he looked at me with wide eyes, clearly shaken by what had just happened. My mom stood silently, staring at me without saying anything, as if waiting for something. And me, I just sat there trying to process what had happened. I never in my life imagined, even in a nightmare, that my father would kick me out of the house. At that moment, I had the gut feeling that this birthday party would be the last time I ever sat at the same table with them. About a minute later, my mom broke the silence. She looked at me with a cold stare, then said, "Apologize to your father for what you just said." Faced with her unreasonable demand, I responded coldly, "I didn't say anything wrong. I just told the truth. You've always favored Dylan." The moment I said that, my mom became furious. It was the first time I had stood up to them directly. Every word I said, every expression on my face showed that I wasn't afraid. Nothing like what they expected. I'd been fed up with this unfairness for far too long. A few seconds later, maybe because he couldn't take any more of their nonsense, my grandfather finally spoke up. He looked at my dad, then turned to my mom with a calm but firm voice, and he said, "Hazel's right. You've both favored Dylan way too much." For a brief moment, I thought my dad, who had been raised and taught by this very man, might reflect on those words. But I was wrong. Right after my grandfather finished speaking, my dad turned and yelled at him, "Shut up, Dad. What do you know about how I raise my kids?" After that outburst, I expected my grandfather to lose his temper, but he didn't. He was so calm it shocked me. He just looked at my dad with eyes full of disappointment, letting out a long, weary sigh. He didn't say another word to him. Instead, he turned to me, his eyes full of compassion, and said, "Pack your things. You don't need to stay somewhere you're not wanted. Come live with me." When I heard those words, my chest tightened. It hit me so hard. I almost broke down, but I held it in. I wasn't about to cry in front of the people who had just thrown me out. Without making my grandfather wait, I quietly pulled back my chair. Then I walked into my room and started packing my things. After everything that happened in that family drama, I knew that from this moment forward, my grandfather would be the only family I had left. And I realized that my life had just taken a completely different path. All because of their favoritism and one truth I finally dared to speak out loud. In my room, I stood in the middle of a space that had always felt familiar, but suddenly felt like a stranger to it. This was the room I had lived in for 18 years, where I had grown from a child to a teenager to a young adult. Every corner, every shelf, every mark on the wall carried a memory. I looked around at the bed where I had slept thousands of nights, the desk where I had done my homework from elementary school through high school, the bookshelf filled with stories I used to love, the posters and certificates I'd earned at school still hung on the walls. With every item I pulled from its place and tucked into my backpack, it felt like I was tearing pieces of my life away. The blue hoodie Mom gave me for my 16th birthday. The journal I started writing in 9th grade. The small gift Dylan gave me back when we still got along. My hands were trembling as I packed, and emptiness spread through me. I couldn't believe I was leaving this house, not because I wanted to, but because I was being forced out. After 18 years of living under this roof, I used to believe it would always be where I could return to. But now I realized I'd been wrong. I was just a guest in my own family. I knew I wasn't just packing my things when I zipped up the backpack. I was packing away my childhood, dreams about a happy family, and everything I had once called home. As I looked around the room one last time, I silently said goodbye to my past. About 20 minutes later, I carried my only backpack, packed with all my belongings and personal items, out to the car with my grandfather. It was heavy on my shoulders, but nowhere near as heavy as the weight pressing down on my heart. As I left, my dad remained at the dining table, arms crossed, his face rigid and emotionless. He didn't look at me. He didn't say a word. Not even the smallest gesture to show he cared that his daughter was walking out the door. My mom got up and followed me to the door. Each step she took echoed down the silent hallway. When I opened the front door and stepped into the cool night air to meet the taxi with my grandfather, the breeze hit my face just as she said something that stopped me cold. "You'll regret this day." Hearing those words felt like a knife straight to the heart. That wasn't a goodbye from a mother to her child. It was a curse, bitter and cruel. As for Dylan, he followed me and my grandfather outside, but not to say goodbye. I knew exactly what he was up to the moment I saw the smug grin on his face. When I climbed into the taxi, he was the one who closed the door for me. But just before he did, he looked at me with that same mocking smile and said, "Good luck, Hazel." Then he let out a loud, bitter laugh and turned back toward the house. His laughter echoed in the night, stinging like an insult I couldn't shake. Sensing how shaken I was, my grandfather touched my shoulder. That warm, steady hand grounded me. In a calm, gentle voice, he said, "Stay calm. You still have me." Moments later, the taxi pulled away, carrying me toward my grandfather's home, leaving behind the people I once called Dad, Mom, and Brother, along with the house I had grown up in. As we drove away from that familiar street, I knew my life had just turned to a new chapter. That night, my grandfather had thoughtfully prepared a warm, cozy bedroom for me. He changed the sheets, set up a small nightlight, and placed a water bottle on the table. But I couldn't sleep. I still couldn't come to terms with being kicked out of my family on my birthday. Every time I thought about what had just happened, pain stabbed at my chest. Why did things turn out this way? Why had I been forced to endure such unfairness for so many years? Those questions kept circling in my mind over and over. Lying in the dark, memories of all the times my parents favored Dylan came flooding back. Each moment and image played in my head like scenes from a movie. I remembered when we were younger, Mom and Dad used to treat us equally. If Dylan got a gift, I got one too. If he had a birthday party and got to invite his friends, I had the same experience. Back then, I truly believed I was an essential part of the family. But everything started to change when I was 8. That year, my parents went on a trip. They met a street fortune teller during a visit to an old town and drew a tarot card. After that moment, everything changed. I still remember the day they came back. The look on their faces was different. Something had shifted in how they saw me. The fortune teller had told them, "The eldest son will become successful, but the younger one, she will destroy this family." After hearing those baseless words, my parents slowly changed the way they treated me. From that day on, Dylan became the golden child, and I was labeled the threat, the ticking time bomb. Even though Dylan was an average student, he was showered with love and praise. Every small achievement of his was treated like a major accomplishment. On the other hand, no matter how well I performed in school, they barely acknowledged it. I could top the class. All I'd get was a passing nod. Dylan's birthdays were always big celebrations. Mine? Just a rushed supermarket cake and no friends invited. They invested in Dylan's education without hesitation. For me, nothing. When Dylan turned 16, he got a brand new laptop for school. When I turned 16 and needed one for myself, they told Dylan to give me his used laptop, then bought him an even newer one. Even friends and neighbors noticed the favoritism. Some even approached my parents, urging them to treat us equally. Whenever that happened, Dad would tell them the story of what the fortune teller had said. And after hearing it, people would shake their heads, telling my parents not to put their faith in such baseless predictions. But no matter how often they were warned, Mom and Dad never changed. They clung to that prophecy like it was the absolute truth. And in the end, things played out exactly as the fortune teller had said. I had destroyed the family on my 18th birthday. And maybe, just maybe, kicking me out had been part of their plan all along. Lying there in my grandfather's guest room, I couldn't help but wonder. Was my fate written in advance? I didn't want to believe it, but after everything that had happened, that question haunted me. While still lost in my thoughts, I heard the soft creak of a door opening from the room next to mine. The quiet night made even the slightest sound noticeable. My grandfather was still awake. He stepped out onto the porch, probably unable to sleep, just like me. His mind likely troubled by everything that had just happened. I quickly got up and joined him outside. The night air was cool, carrying a faint scent of jasmine from the small garden nearby. He sat in his old wooden chair, and I sat on the porch steps. He didn't say a word. We just sat there in silence under the soft, pale light of the moon. But when I looked into his eyes, I could see how deeply he was hurting over the choices my parents had made. His eyes were heavy with sorrow, the kind of sorrow a father feels when watching his child make a mistake he can't stop. Every so often he sighed, resting his hands on his knees and staring out into the distance. I could feel his pain, the pain of watching a family fall apart right in front of him. About 30 minutes later, as the air grew colder and the night wind picked up, he and I returned inside. He touched my shoulder just before I returned to his prepared room. With a warm, steady voice, he said, "Stay strong, Hazel. You're not alone. I've got your back." Hearing those words lit a fire in me. It felt like strength suddenly surged through my chest. Those words woke me up. That was when I decided I would stand on my own 2 feet. I wouldn't rely on the people I used to call mom and dad. From that point on, I knew I had to be stronger than I had ever been before. With 2 months left before my first semester of college, I took on a part-time job while staying at my grandfather's house. I didn't want to sit around and let my mind spiral through everything that had happened. When I told my grandfather about my plans, he encouraged me to rest instead. He was worried I was still too shaken by everything and needed time to recover mentally. He reminded me that I was still young and there was no need to rush into worrying about money. But I didn't take his advice. I looked him in the eye and said firmly, "I need to work because staying busy is the only way I won't keep thinking about what happened." After hearing that, he gave me a quiet nod of support. I knew that if I stayed home, I'd only be consumed by thoughts of my family, the injustice, the betrayal, the last words my mother said before I left. Working gave me something else to focus on. I found a job at a coffee shop near my grandfather's house. I worked 12-hour shifts every day from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. The job wasn't easy, but I found comfort in the exhaustion. It felt good to be busy. By the end of nearly 2 months, I had earned close to $2,000 from all those long days. That money would help ease the financial pressure during my first few months of college. But more importantly, the job helped me let go of the pain and shift my focus toward the future. After 2 months at my grandfather's house, it was time to say goodbye and move into the dorms in Denver. That day came faster than I expected, and my heart felt heavy knowing I was leaving the only person who truly loved me. The morning I left, my grandfather didn't cry, but his eyes were filled with sadness. He tried to keep a calm expression, but I could see it, the weight behind his quiet gaze. He stood on the porch, hands clasped behind his back, watching me pack my bags. Just as I was about to get into the car, he walked over and gently reminded me, "Take care of your health, study hard, make sure you eat regularly, and don't stay up too late." Hearing those words, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I broke down. Tears rolled down my face, no matter how hard I tried to stop them. Maybe it was because I had never received that kind of genuine care from anyone else in my family before. Before getting in the car, I hugged him tightly and said, "Please take care of yourself too. Don't forget to take your medicine on time." I promised I'd visit on weekends or during the holidays. It was only a 2-hour drive, but deep down, I knew my class schedule would make it hard to visit as often as I wanted. That thought made the goodbye even harder. As the taxi started to pull away, I looked back through the rearview mirror. My grandfather stood on the porch watching the car drive off. That image of him standing alone is something I'll never forget. At that moment, I promised myself that no matter what happened, I would never forget the love my grandfather had given me. He was the only one who truly loved me, and I would never let him down. A week after I moved into the dorms, I received a surprise notification from the bank. $1,500 had been deposited into my account. I checked the details, and to my shock, the sender was my grandfather. Immediately, I grabbed my phone and called him to confirm. Maybe he sent it by mistake, or there had been some mix-up. But the moment I heard his voice on the other end, I realized it was no accident. He calmly said to me, "Don't worry about anything. Just focus on your studies. I've got savings and my retirement pension. I can support you through all 4 years." Hearing those words, my chest tightened. I was overwhelmed by his generosity, and in that moment, I couldn't accept it. I told him, "Grandpa, I can't take this. I can't let someone over 70 years old carry that burden for me." I explained that I was fully capable of working part-time to support myself. I didn't want to put any more weight on his shoulders, especially at his age. But he had already made up his mind. His voice turned firm as he said, "If you don't accept the money I send monthly, don't call me Grandpa anymore." His words left me stunned. I knew he wasn't joking, and I reluctantly agreed to accept the money with no way to argue against his decision. After the call ended, I silently sat in my dorm room, making a quiet promise to myself. I would never forget the sacrifice he made for me. He gave me all the love and support that my parents never did. I would study hard to be worthy of everything he's done for me. Thanks to the money my grandfather sent me every month, I didn't have to work part-time in the following months. I was able to focus entirely on my studies. I poured all my time into classes, research, and extracurricular activities without the constant stress of paying for food or housing. I felt lighter, more motivated than ever to succeed. After 4 years, I graduated with honors and a GPA of 3.8. Several major companies offered me jobs with impressive salaries. Ultimately, I chose to work at a logistics company in Denver, the city I call home now. Once I started working and had a stable income, I made it a point to visit my grandfather more often. When I was a student with a packed schedule, I could only see him once a month, and every time I came home, I noticed he looked a little older. That worried me. But now, I visit almost every weekend, keeping the promise I made years ago. I wanted to spend as much time with him as possible to make up for all the years he had spent alone. I bought him a high-quality wool sweater when I received my first paycheck. He tried it on and said he'd never owned anything so lovely. The happiness on his face, that genuine smile, it made every hardship I had faced feel completely worth it. In the following months, I bought him more things: a comfortable pair of walking shoes, a blood pressure monitor, and a massage chair so he could relax. I wanted him to have the most comfortable life possible in his old age. I believed that the worst was behind me, after the family drama at my parents' house when I was 18. I thought I was stepping into a chapter of peace, one where I would grow older beside my grandfather and care for him the way he had once cared for me. But fate again decided to play a cruel joke on me. It took him away a year ago. My grandfather's funeral took place on a gray Thursday in September. I had called my parents and Dylan to tell them he had passed, but none of them showed up. That day, I stood alone beside his casket in a quiet funeral home. Only a few neighbors and some of his lifelong friends came to offer their condolences. They shook my hand, spoke kind words, tried to comfort me, but all I felt was emptiness. Without any family present, the funeral felt lonelier and colder than I could have ever imagined. When the casket was carried to the cemetery, I followed in silence. A drizzle began to fall, soaking my shoulders. I looked down into the deep grave where he would be laid to rest, and a wave of anger began to rise inside me. One question echoed in my mind. How could they not be here on the most important day? My grandfather was my father's father, Dylan's grandfather. No matter what had happened, he was still their family. And yet, they chose to ignore it entirely, as if he had meant nothing to them. I thought back to the years he spent taking care of me, worrying about me, sacrificing everything so I could go to college. Meanwhile, my parents and Dylan only ever thought about themselves. Even when the man who had raised them and loved them passed away, they couldn't spare a single day to say goodbye. The anger in my chest turned into something more profound: resentment. I resented them for their selfishness, for how they treated my grandfather while he was alive, and especially for their absence that day. As the earth poured onto his grave, I stood alone in the rain. Rain and tears blurred together on my face. And in that moment, I made myself a promise. I would never forgive them for this. In the days following my grandfather's death, life slowly began to return to its usual rhythm. I went back to work, doing my best to bury the grief deep inside. Every morning when I woke up, I still half expected to see his name on my phone, checking in on me. Or imagine myself driving back to visit him over the weekend like I always did. But the harsh reality kept reminding me he was gone. I threw myself into work, hoping it would help dull the pain. But I didn't know that my grandfather had left me something far more valuable than I ever imagined. 30 days after his funeral, I got a call from his lawyer. Margaret Wilson, a woman in her 50s, dressed in a formal black suit, called me on a quiet Wednesday afternoon. In her professional tone, she said, "We need to meet to go over Mr. Williams' will. Would you be available this Friday at 2 p.m. at our office?" I agreed immediately, though I couldn't help feeling a little confused. My grandfather had never mentioned a will or anything about having assets. I assumed at most he might have left me a few personal keepsakes, some mementos. When I arrived at the law office that Friday, I was surprised to see my parents and Dylan already there. They had arrived before me and were sitting in the waiting room. The space between us felt like a thick, invisible wall, built from years of silence, distance, and resentment. They looked at me with hostility. My father's eyes were cold, blank of any emotion. My mother turned her face away, pretending I wasn't even there. Dylan glanced at me with the same contempt he always carried, as if I were some intruder who didn't belong. I quietly sat in the farthest corner of the room, putting as much space between us as possible. The air was so tense it felt like you could slice it with a knife. No one said a word. We sat there waiting, drenched in a silence that said everything. A few minutes later, Margaret Wilson stepped into the room. She carried a black leather briefcase, which she placed carefully on the table before opening it and pulling out a neatly arranged stack of legal documents. Her eyes briefly scanned the room, clearly aware of the tension lingering in the air. With a formal and composed tone, she began reading the will. We are gathered here today for the reading of Mr. William Miller's last will. According to the will, which has been legally written and notarized, the estate will be distributed as follows." The room fell dead silent. Everyone held their breath. My parents looked so tense, it seemed like they were preparing for a fight. Then, after a brief pause, she looked directly at me and said, "The house where Mr. William resided, along with a sum of $500,000, will be inherited by Hazel Miller." I was utterly stunned. $500,000, a number I had never even dared to imagine. I sat frozen, trying to process what I had just heard. Across the room, my parents and Dylan were fuming, their faces turned red with anger. Their eyes burned with disbelief. After announcing my inheritance, Ms. Wilson then turned toward them and continued, "Mr. David, Mrs. Madison, and Mr. Dylan Miller will receive the family photo album Mr. William collected over the years." Yeah. She reached into her case and pulled out a thick, worn, leather-bound album. The brown cover was faded with age, one I recognized instantly. It was the same album my grandfather used to flip through during quiet evenings, filled with hundreds of photos spanning decades of our family's history. Seeing that all they were left with was an old photo album, while I had inherited the house and a large sum of money, they completely lost control. Dylan especially. He stood up abruptly, his face twisted with fury. Without hesitation, he snatched the album from Ms. Wilson's hands. He ripped it open and began tearing the pages apart violently. My parents didn't stop him. They looked on with silent approval, as if they agreed with every shred. The family photo album, filled with decades of memories, was being ripped apart right before me in just seconds. Photos of my grandfather in his youth, snapshots of happier times, smiles once shared by a family that no longer existed, all torn to pieces and scattered across the floor. Frozen in shock, I quickly knelt and started gathering the torn photos. I told myself I could tape them back together. These were the last pieces I had left of my grandfather, his memories, his legacy. I couldn't let them be destroyed like this. At that moment, Margaret Wilson rose from her chair, her expression stern and composed. She looked directly at the three of them and said clearly, "I'm sorry to inform you, but the three of you have made a serious mistake." They all froze. Dylan stopped mid-tear, pieces of the photo still in his hand. My parents looked at each other, confused and visibly alarmed. Ms. Wilson continued, her tone steady. "In Mr. Williams' will, there is a special clause. If David, Madison, and Dylan treat this album with care and respect, they will receive an inheritance of $600,000. The room fell dead silent. I saw panic flash in my parents' and Dylan's eyes. My father immediately asked, "What if we already tore it up?" And Ms. Wilson looked at them, then replied slowly and clearly, "If the album is destroyed, thrown away, or otherwise disrespected, $600,000 will go to Hazel instead." It was as if lightning had struck the room. They all looked down at the torn photographs scattered across the floor, realizing they had just thrown away a fortune in minutes. Dylan dropped the remaining pieces still in his hand. His face turned pale. My father shouted, "This can't be real! This is a setup!" My mother collapsed into a chair, covering her face as she sobbed uncontrollably, consumed by regret. Ms. Wilson remained calm and explained, "This is a legally binding will. Mr. William anticipated this kind of reaction. He wanted to test the hearts of his family." Her words deepened my respect for my grandfather. He had known. He had planned for this. While they sat there in shock and regret, I quietly continued picking up the fragments of the photos from the floor. I now fully understood why my grandfather had added that clause. He wanted to know if they truly valued family and the memories they shared. And now the answer was clear. They had failed his final test completely. After everything that had happened, attorney Margaret Wilson finalized the legal process and informed me that I would receive a total of $1.1 million and my grandfather's house. My parents and Dylan left in silence, their faces twisted with a mix of regret and barely contained rage. I stayed behind, quietly collecting every torn photo from the floor. Ms. Wilson handed me a small box to hold the fragments. That evening, I sat alone in my grandfather's house, patiently piecing the photos back together. It was slow, delicate work that required patience and care, but it felt meaningful. With each photo I restored, it was as if I were rescuing a part of my grandfather's memory, a part of him that deserved to live on. 1 year later, my life had fully settled. I used a portion of the inheritance to make smart investments, building enough passive income to live comfortably without the stress of grinding day in and day out. The photo album, now carefully restored, sits preserved behind glass in my living room. Every time I look at it, I'm reminded of my grandfather's final lesson. Love and respect can't be bought with money. To this day, my parents and Dylan haven't reached out. Maybe they're still filled with regret over their foolish choices. Or maybe they're still angry, thinking I took what should have been theirs. But I don't care anymore. I've come to understand that family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by love and by those who truly stand by you. And for me, that person will always be my grandfather, William. Today marks exactly 1 year since my grandfather passed away. As I stood quietly by his grave in the early morning light, I decided to share the story with all of you. Through this story, I want to say one thing. If your grandparents are still with you, visit them often. They may not say it out loud, but your presence means more than you think. And at their age, they can leave at any moment. Please don't wait until they're gone to feel the weight of regret for not being there when you still had the chance. I also want to share the valuable lessons my grandfather taught me. That love cannot be bought with money, but it can be shown through small, everyday actions. Never let the words of fortune tellers or the judgments of others determine how you treat your children. Every child deserves to be loved equally. Favoritism in a family can leave scars, deep ones that last a lifetime. And sometimes, the person you feared would destroy the family turns out to be the only one who ever honestly tried to preserve its meaning. I've learned that standing up for fairness isn't destroying a family. It's protecting yourself. My grandfather taught me that sometimes it takes real courage to say no to injustice, even if it means standing alone. And before I end the story, I want to ask you something. Do you think I was the one who destroyed the family, just like that fortune teller told my parents all those years ago? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think. And if this story touched you in any way, please don't forget to subscribe, like, and share so others can hear it too and reflect on their own stories. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next chapter.